React. I hope the recordings are saved because it says that slides. It says that there is the cloud space is full, but I think they are saved. Let me share my screen. And I'm going to start with this. Okay, so React is another one of these popular frameworks, and we wanted you to see both of them, so to see two, so that you can also start seeing the differences between the two, but also the similarities, and see how when you learn one, you can have some of the things that you have learned from this one. They sound familiar, and it makes it easier to learn a new one, even if at the beginning it's actually a bit confusing because the syntax is different. And so where in Vue we were using maybe double quotes or the double mustache syntaxes, then in React is a simple mustache, and then you end up making some silly errors at the beginning. And I will probably do that also. I was more confused. I mean, I was more used with React before getting into Vue, and now just because the last 2 weeks we were working with Vue, now I think I'm like, how was React? I have to think about it again. So it will take a bit of time. And we will see what the React is and how do you write components in React, because React is also based on components. What does it mean to be to have a unidirectional data flow? And how do you pass properties to children in React? So props, basically, as you have seen also in Vue, we have to pass props and some parameters to the children of the tree. How do you manage state in React? You will listen to this state word a lot. We have seen it also in Vue. It's how the data that make the pages reactive and make the page re-render every time there is some change to the data. That is what we call manage state, manage this reactive data. And then we also need to see how do we pass data upwards on the tree. So remember in Vue, we had props flowing down, and then with the emit events, we were passing data up to parents. Kind of similar, a bit of different in React. We will see these things then. So the most popular frameworks currently, I think there is a fourth one that it's coming up pretty strong. It's called Svetle. But at least I think still the three most popular are these ones, the Angular, React, and Vue. And it is surprising actually because, I mean, Angular and React are backed by big companies like Google and Facebook. And Vue was just created by one person, Mr. Evan Yu. And it was still so well done so that it became popular because it was very easy to get into that. It has less, smaller, how is it called? Lower learning curve of a Vue than the other two. Especially Angular, at the beginning, it was much simpler using JavaScript, but then they made some updates with later versions of Angular that made it so complicated that people started leaving Angular and going to other frameworks because it was like learning a framework from the beginning. It was not an update that was a small update. They changed completely everything. So it was now based on TypeScript, and then it started losing its popularity, although it was most popular maybe 5 years ago or so. So these are the three that are the current popular. I think if we check somewhere, we will see the list, how it goes every year, which is the most popular currently.
Yes. Sorry, could I ask a quick question?
Yes.
With like the variety of frameworks and kind of different frameworks coming in, like being trendy or whatever, do like in the field, in a job situation, how often do like projects get translated, I guess, to a different framework? Or is like are people adopting new frameworks and using them for new projects? So they would have things written in Vue and also Angular, or is it kind of a mix, do you think? I'm just curious like how that would work if it's changing so quickly, you know?
I think a company normally has one framework that works with, and it doesn't change that often, even if new things are coming. So it will need, so that if it has to change, it will need to change many things, because it's not the best to have both of them working at the same thing at the same app with both frameworks, like half components with one, half with others. It wouldn't work. So in order to not have to refactor all your projects and all your apps to the new framework, you normally stick with one framework, even if new ones come, unless there is some reason, I don't know, like some bigger change, because this is really becoming very old and you need to refactor your code. But inside the company, normally the company works with one framework. So one company will be working with React, and then maybe you will go to another and will be working with Angular. And so they don't work with many frameworks at the same time.
That makes sense. Thanks.
It's not clicking. Okay. So as all the frameworks, so these three also, they started with like version 1 was something, and then maybe version 2, there was some major change, and version 3, some major change. In Vue also, there were some changes between the version 2 and version 3. And you will, if we search a bit more on Vue, you will see that there is this change from options API to composition API. I think it's works. So the syntax is changing a bit. We have seen Vue based on options API, which is more of the version 2, but the newer code in Vue, they can be written in a different syntaxes. So this is a bit confusing. It takes a bit of work, because sometimes they do this major change even inside the same framework, and you need to learn a whole new syntaxes even for the same framework. And this also happened with React. So React started with the component, its component being a class. This was the initial, I don't know, before some version, I don't know if it was React version 15 or something, I don't remember the number exactly. So its component, it was a class. And there was also function components, but there were like dummy components that didn't have any data, that was just used for showing UE. So for Vue only, UI. But nowadays, with the latest versions of React, everything moved towards functions. So now, mostly all programmers that they use the latest versions of React, they use function components. There are some differences in the syntaxes. I think I have some example here. So this we will understand better when we start understanding a bit more of the React syntaxes. So before, its component was a class. And as a class, remember, we have seen in JavaScript how classes work. They had a constructor. Remember, we have seen classes, a constructor, super, because with the super, you were calling the constructor of the class that it was extending. So, and then here with this state, we were setting up the data. This was like the equivalent of the data part of the view. And then we also had some methods inside the class as class methods. And we also had to use everywhere that these, everywhere you had to use the this keyword in order to refer to the different parts of the class. And at the end, there was also a render method, which was what would be the equivalent of the template in Vue, where all the HTML was written. So that's how it was before. And nowadays we use for the same, if it was, it's exactly the same example. Right now, it doesn't make a lot of sense because we have not seen the syntaxes of React, but now we use functions. So we set the same component, but we set it as a function with a name, and it accepts some arguments. And then for defining the reactive data, we use a hook that it's called use state. We will see how to use this. And here we define all the data that this component will be using. We have other functions nested inside the bigger function that will handle some events or some helper functions that we need. And then we have this return statement again with the HTML part. So a basic component in React is a function, can be a class, but we will see the function part. Here we can see it also. This is a very simple one, and it's actually written in a form of an arrow function, but it's still a function, right? So it is a function footer that accepts some props, so it accepts some arguments that are coming from the parent, same as was happening with view props. And it's always a function that it returns some HTML. It's not HTML, it looks like HTML, but what it returns is something that is called JSX, which is a mixture of HTML and JavaScript. And here, this is very simple, so it's just HTML, and it looks like if it's HTML, but in fact, it's JSX, and we could include in here JavaScript bits, same as we were doing in the template in Vue, that it seemed like HTML, but then we could include JavaScript bits in there so that we can show some parameters, some data, or we could put some for loop in there or some if statement in there. And so the same we could do here in the return part. So this would be, in the return, would be our equivalent to a template in Vue. And function components also have states. State is for managing the data that is based on hooks. Hooks, we call hooks some libraries that are already defined in React. So we import them from the React base code and we can use them. So are predefined libraries that make our life easier. And also it has life cycle moments, same as we have seen in Vue, like when a component is mounted, when a component is created, we can load and use this life cycle as well through hooks. And we will be focusing on this way of implementing components. There is also the class component. So if you see some tutorial, depends on which React version is using. So if you check on YouTube, you may be like a bit surprised, what is the syntax that it's using? So just have in mind that maybe she's using or he's using the class type, the class syntaxes. When there is a class in the like a specific class set on the component, the class keyword, and you see constructor and stuff, then this means that this is a class component. And they have their own constructor and the data is defined in here, and they have some defined lifecycle methods as well. So the function component receives as arguments props that are coming from the parent, and they can be receiving also other arguments that are the references, refs, but we won't be using them for now. And what they return, it's an JSX element, as it's called. So this part, the return part, is a JSX element. Now we will see a bit more of the JSX. One thing to remember is that the component is always capitalized. So you should use a capital letter when you define a component. I think we were doing the same thing in Vue as well. So we were saying the component app, and app was with a capital letter, or button. If it was like a custom-made component, a custom-made element, we were capitalizing this. And we can use other components inside the component. So, for example, here, we have this component that is a function that is called app. It has some data defined, and it returns this part that is this JSX element, and see how it includes, in between other HTML elements, it can also include another component that we have created, maybe in a different file, or in this case, because it is a very simple component, it's actually created up here in the same file. So this is still a component, it's just one line, but it's still a component because it is a function. It is a function, we capitalize it. It's just written in the way of an arrow function because it's a very simple one, but it is a function that it has no props in this case, and it returns a JSX part, which looks like HTML. So this component just returns this H2 element. So when I include it in some other component, it will replace this with what the other component returns, which is this one. So this will be included in here if I had to run this code. But again, normally, unless it's something very simple and very silly like this, each component should be on its own file, same as we were doing with Vue. So in JSX, it's JavaScript XML. It looks a lot like HTML, but it's just a way for programmers to have it easier to understand what they write, because if we translate this to real JSX, to real JavaScript, so it uses what is called Babel. Let me check. Babel. The compiler for next generation JavaScript. Try it out. Let me try. I copy this code. So what it happens on the back is that Babel compiler, which is included whenever we create a React program, it takes this thing that it looks like HTML and it translates it in JavaScript commands, like with React library, create element, div. So the first one, this line, means that you will be creating an element of type div. It has inside of it nested, so null if it takes some arguments. So here it doesn't have any attributes, so it is null. If we had some attributes in here, it wouldn't be null. And then comma React create element, so it has nested inside of it another React element of type H1, because you see that we open the div, it's like a root on the tree, and inside we have other elements nested. And so it would be translated like this. You could actually copy this code and use it in your React component, but it would be a lot messier to write and to keep track which one is nested inside. That's why we use this JSX and the Babel compiler to be able to write like this and still JavaScript and React to be able to understand it. Okay, so it's just for making our life easier that we use this JSX. And now it's very simple because it looks exactly like HTML, but at the moment that we start incorporating in here JavaScript, it can be much messier with HTML and JavaScript altogether, but we get used to this. So a couple of rules to have in mind for the return part is that we have only to have one root element per component. We have mentioned that also in Vue. So see that here we have one div that encloses all the other elements. So the return must return one root element with anything we want inside of it nested, but there should be like one root element. And sometimes you will even see an empty element, not a div. It's also acceptable so that you return and you don't write anything in here. You just have these quotes, I don't know how these are called, so that they enclose all the others. But the most recommended is that you at least add a div to include everything inside a div per component. And then whenever we want to write some JavaScript code inside here, we use these curly brackets. So if we wanted to include this name, Sophia, we have here this parameter, and we want to include it in our code. And so we use the curly brackets to make sure to understand that this part now is JavaScript, and it makes reference to some parameter that was defined before. So we escape the HTML and we say that now here it's JavaScript code. And all components are capitalized. So to pass a prop to the children, we included in the component. This is similar as we have done in Vue. We can pass as many properties as we want. So leave this part for now. Let's go down here to this component. So the app component, it returns this div that it includes two other components, custom components that I'm creating, a heading component and a super heading component. So in this component, I want to pass a prop that is which color we'll be having. And I'm passing it just like this. I don't have to bind it with the with a semicolon as I was doing in Vue. So I'm just saying that I will be passing a parameter that it's color and that has this value of red. So this super heading component, if I check it, it's declared here. It's expecting some properties. One of them is the color. This is a default value in case I didn't pass any color. It could be black as a default value, but the color, since now I'm passing red, it will be taking red as value. And there is another special property that is called children. We will not be using children a lot. I think it's not that useful for now. We will be using normal props, but children, it's a special prop that makes reference to the data that it is in between the start and end of a component. So this part here, the text part, it will be stored in a special prop that is called children. So in each component, you actually get two props. One is children and one is an object called props. And inside the props object, you have all the different attributes that you set in here on this part. So this heading, for example, it has no props because we have no attributes, but it does have a children special prop. And so we can pass this, and if we do it like this, here it will replace children with H2 heading. The examples here on the slides are not the most helpful, but we will see them when we start coding better, how we pass the props and everything. The idea is the same as in Vue. We define our component and we pass different variables here as attributes, as HTML attributes, and then the component expects this. It receives them as props, and then inside the component, they can be used for modifying a styling, for showing some data, for whatever we want. So, and speaking about data, of course, each component needs to understand, to use some data, some reactive data, that whenever it changes, it will re-render the component, it will show the changes. And so for this, we use a hook that is called useState. So inside the component, we defined which data we'll be using. And it has a special syntaxes. It's not as simple as when we were creating the data object in Vue and we were just defining name, empty string, I don't know, age, 0, setting it to 0. So here we need to use this useState hook. And the useState returns, it's a hook that it's a kind of function that it returns an array. And the array includes two elements. The first element is the name of the component, of the data, sorry, not of the component, of the data, of the parameter. And the second element, it's a function for modifying this parameter. We cannot modify, we can never modify state directly in React. So we can never just say number of clicks equals to 3. We have this piece of data here, like for example, if it was a counter or this one that counts a number of clicks, and we define it. But if we want to update this number, so if we console log it here, it's 0 because this is the initial value that we have set here. So in the useState, we pass inside the parentheses the initial value that this data will have. Then if we want to modify it, we cannot just modify it by just saying number of clicks equals to 2 or to 1 or plus plus. we have to use the function that it is set here, that it is defined here. And we have to use this function to update the number of clicks. So we update it, and then it can be seen. We will see this also. As I was saying, these examples here are more confusing than helpful, but just keep from this that whenever we have to create some kind of reactive piece of data, we need to use the useState hook, and we will see today some ways of using this. And the useState, it returns these two elements, the name of the data and a function that will help us modify this data, because we cannot modify them directly. So hooks are functions that we include that enhance our functionality on a component, and they normally start with use and something else. We will just see two types of hooks. There are 5 or 6 or 7 in React that they are the most common. useState is the most common, actually, because it's what it allows us to manage the data. And useEffect, it's also a common one that it allows us to create some of these life cycle methods, like if we want to do something when the component is created or then the component is loaded for the first time, then we will use the useEffect hook. They all start with the word use, and there is also the use context for allowing us to set some global data, and the use refs for allowing us to set references, but we'll not see this other for now. And so the useState hook, we import all the hooks that we want to use. We import them from React. So on the top of our component, we import the hooks that we want to use from React. And then inside our component, we use the useState hook. So in this case, we want to define a counter as a reactive data, and we use the useState hook to define that this count parameter is a reactive state, and that there is the setCount function that we will use in order to update it. And this counter starts with an initial value of 100. So in here, it's the starting value. And so in this case, it updates automatically because it is done through a timer. So every second, this set interval sets a timer. It's a JavaScript thing. So everything in here, since it is a JavaScript function, everything in here is JavaScript. Only in the return part, it's where we start mixing JavaScript and HTML. So the return part of the component is what would be our template in Vue. And then in here, we can do whatever we would do in a normal function, create other functions, call other functions that we have somewhere else, or write some updating of data, etc. And so with the interval, it uses this setCount function to update the state and to make the counter smaller by 1. And so same as we did with Vue, we'll use these single page applications in React. So we can use some if as well as we did in Vue in order, for example, to show one view or the other view. So in here, it's a bit different. In Vue, we had it inside the admin view, we had the if case. Here we can do it. We can return one or the other, checking again a Boolean parameter is admin so that we show one or the other. In fact, we will see that in React, we will see it later, not in these 2 weeks. We will see it with some extra classes that we will do later in the project phase. There is something that is called React Router that will help us set routes in a different way, not like this, because of course, imagine that we have a menu with different views showing whenever you click something, you see a different page. Then we don't normally do it like this with a huge if, else if, or whatever. This is just if we have these 2 views, and with a simple if else, we could do it. And so let me see. So the props is a way to pass information and data from a parent to a child, same as it was in Vue. And React is considered a unidirectional framework because everything propagates downwards. All the changes, the data updates, everything propagate downwards. And whenever we want to send something upwards to a parent from a child, how we were doing it in Vue, we were emitting an event. We were emitting an event in a child component, and the parent had to listen for that event. Here it's kind of the same, but it is like the parent is already passing the function that the children has to call when it needs to pass something up to it. Okay, so we already, this is the parent component. So let's say that we have this function app that is a parent component, and then we have a form that is a child component. And so inside this function app, the parent component, we include this child component, and we already pass as a prop the function that the child has to call when it needs to inform us for some change. It's like if the parent is saying to the child, here is my phone number. If you want something from me, call me on this number or something. So the function is created in here on the parent, and it's passed down as a prop to the child, so that whenever the child needs to, like there is a button in here, we have the form in a child component, and we have to like on click, then we call this function that the parent send us downwards. Okay, so we call this function, and then that means that this function will be handled, will be clicked on the parent. The idea is the same conceptually as in Vue, but it is a bit different. This is called the callback function, and it is a bit different in the sense that at the end in React, we suppose that everything flows downwards, even the events. So in Vue, we're supposing that events that were like, they could be emitted upwards from the child to a parent. Now everything is unidirectional. Even the functions that the child has to use, they can have to be created on the parent and sent down. And so it works a bit differently. So the React documentation, it's also really good, and you have various things to see: the JSX, how we render the elements, the props, the state, and the lists. So how we render the lists. In Vue, we were doing it with the v-for directive. Here we are doing it using a map, the map higher order function. So here we will be using map all the time, because it is the way that React uses for rendering, for actually doing a for loop over an object or an array. So it always uses the map, and we will be using it a lot. So at the end of the session today, we will do some pair programming, which is not actually programming, because we will just check the documentation, check how lists and keys are working, and maybe discuss with each other what we see different and we don't understand. And so then you just download the activity at the end, and we'll see how it's structured. So as it says, I think it's also written on the README file of the activity, at least for this first couple of days. The idea is to just check the code, spend a couple of hours to go through the resources, check the code that it's given from the activity, and see how it's structured and how all the files are connected. Okay, I think that's all for the slides. We will understand some of the things better with the examples, but in case you have some doubt coming now, I'm here. Let me close this. So, questions? let's have a small break, and we'll start with some live coding so that we'll see React in action, and when we see it in the screen, it will be easier. Okay, so let's take 10 minutes break and we go with the coding.